Hey guys, welcome to our online history class. Today we are going to be moving into the events of the civil rights movement in the 60s. Before we do that, I want to recap really quickly what we learned in our last lecture or ed puzzle. So this was the concept that we were talking about. The court sets a precedent. This is how the process of civil rights works, right? So the Supreme Court sets a precedent with the case they pass. And then activists use boycotts to pressure businesses to change their policies and nonviolent protests to get national press, which changes people's minds, which leads to laws. Okay, so this is the general concept that we've been working with. In the last lecture, we looked at a couple of events in Eisenhower's term that were specific to this. So we talked about how Brown versus Board of Education desegregated schools, but was met with massive resistance from southern states, and the court is not empowered to enforce its rulings directly. So at that point, activists step onto the stage. Activists like Rosa Parks and the NAACP and Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference campaign to push the Brown desegregation precedent into buses, right? So they're like, what the heck? If schools are desegregated, why not buses? They do that with the Montgomery bus boycott, and that leads to a new court ruling. So the Supreme Court says, yeah, you're right. If schools are desegregated, buses should be too. Okay, the other thing we saw with activists was the Little Rock Nine. Those were 9 high school students who were calling attention to schools where states were resisting integration. And when the governor refused to admit them to the schools, that forced Eisenhower to send federal troops, right? So we're watching this interplay between the Supreme Court, the activists, and the federal enforcement of the laws from other branches that are actually empowered to enforce those rulings. Okay, what we're going to look at today, this is just a quick preview, is in the early 60s. So this is the very end of Eisenhower's term, moving into Kennedy's term. We're going to look at just a couple of events. So the first one is SNCC activists. SNCC is another group. So those activists are going to use sit-ins to push for desegregated restaurants. Remember, we haven't talked about that yet. We've been focusing on schools and buses, and they're like, hey, what about lunch counters? Okay, so that's the first thing. We're also going to see an event called the Freedom Rides, which is going to demonstrate the lack of enforcement of the Supreme Court case desegregating buses. Okay, so they're going to be like, what the heck? Somebody want to come and fix this? So they're actually desegregated. National press coverage of police violence during the Birmingham March is going to change the minds of the public. So a lot of people are going to see pictures from this event. You can see one in the bottom right, that guy getting attacked by dogs, and they're going to change their minds. And then that is going to lead us to the March on Washington, where 250,000 people show up to pressure the government to pass new laws. So this is kind of pushing towards the end where the federal government responds with new legislation. All right, so here we go. We're going to go through these events one at a time. So we're starting with the sit-in movement. So the sit-in movement was begun by 4 Black college students who decided to go in and sit at Woolworth's lunch counter in North Carolina. And you can see a picture of that event below. Those are the 4 Black students that kicked off this entire thing. Okay, so their plan is to sit until they are served. So they're sitting at a white counter. The restaurant says, we won't serve you because you're seated in the wrong section. Okay, so there are 2 benefits of this movement as actually a really interesting blend of the economic pressure and the nonviolent protest. So the first goal of a sit-in is that it creates economic pressure because as long as they sit, the diner doesn't make money, right? So like in this instance, there's only 4 guys there, right? So they're only taking up 4 seats. But imagine as this movement spreads and you have groups of 50 or 100 showing up in a diner, and they basically say, serve me or serve no one, and I'm going to sit here until you serve me. So if they sit there for 6 hours and the restaurant says, we won't serve you, what happens to the restaurant? right? They're not going to make any money during that whole time. And so even though this isn't technically a boycott, right? Boycotts are where you refuse to buy. And in this case, they're saying, we want to buy. Will you let us purchase your sandwich? The impact is actually the same, because as long as the restaurant doesn't serve them, they're not going to make money. And then they have to make a decision between not making money or changing the policy. The other thing that we will see is that restaurants will call police, and the police will come and arrest people, because remember, these are laws that are saying that people can't sit there. And what that does is that takes us into goal number 2, which is this also turns into a nonviolent protest where people or police are going to beat these protesters. The press is going to take photos, and then the rest of the country sees that. It's going to change their minds about what's happening. So, for example, there's a pretty famous photo of a sit-in. You can see all of these are actually just citizens, and they have come in and they're like attacking the protesters with food. You can see they've like dumped food products on top of them. And in fact, the organizations that led these would actually have trainings for this, where they would practice not responding when people were hitting them or yelling at them or dumping things on them. Because frankly, that's not a very natural human response, right? Like somebody hits you, your natural response is to hit back or protect yourself. And so they actually practice this, being able to sit there and not respond. Now, you'll note on there, like the guy on the left is actually white. So these organizations included people of all races. They were not just Black people, and those groups all work together to try to make this change. So these photos start hitting the media. People in the country start talking, and they're like, this isn't cool. We don't support this or whatever. It's starting to change people's minds. The results of this sit-in movement come about in some ways quickly, and some take more time. So the original sit-in movement that started in North Carolina gets going in February of 1960. That's going to continue until many of the restaurants integrate in May, July, and October. But then there is another organization that's formed out of this called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This is also a movement of college students. And they start instigating these protests throughout other states. So not just in North Carolina. They start organizing these sit-ins in Tennessee and like other states where they're asking for these laws to be changed. And those students are actually, in the long run, hoping that the government will also pass legislation that will desegregate the restaurants. And that's going to take a little bit more time. Okay, our next big event is called the Freedom Rides, and this movement is going to demonstrate that Southern states have not yet desegregated buses. Okay, so remember you had the court ruling right after the Montgomery bus boycott that said states had to desegregate buses, but much like what happened with schools, Southern states are dragging their feet, right? They're refusing to desegregate. And so this small group of students decides to hop on a bus. This is actually led by another organization called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. It was led by a young man named James Farmer. And in this event, Black and white members go south on buses to draw attention to the segregation that still existed and to push for enforcement of the Supreme Court ruling. Now, as you can imagine, the resistance to this is pretty strong. You can see a picture below where at one of the stops, the bus was actually firebombed. I'm going to show you on the next slide a map of the bus route. So this is the original bus route in the big picture with the red. You can see it starts up there near DC and then continues throughout the Deep South, right? North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and then eventually ends in Jackson, Mississippi, where over 300 people were arrested. Now, this is originally just a small group of riders. As the riders are beaten or arrested, they have to stop. Other people see the press and they start their own groups of riders. So you can see on that other map, it says background map, there are a whole bunch of different routes. Those are all like other buses that just jumped in on this idea and were like, yeah, we want to participate An estimate about 450 different people participated in this event at some point, and it does end in Jackson when over 300 of these people are arrested. But you can see on the map, they're noting, where buses are attacked, one is firebombed, people are beaten, right? So what's happening here is the press is demonstrating the resistance to actually implementing the Supreme Court ruling. There's another picture of the firebombed bus. Okay, next big event is in Birmingham, which is in Alabama. So in this event, Martin Luther King Jr. and his organization, the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was invited into Birmingham to run a nonviolent campaign. And that is because Birmingham had a whole bunch of unsolved bombings, which basically means like white people had bombed black homes and the police would not investigate it. So no one was held responsible for that violence. They had a really strong history of police brutality. The man who was in charge of the police force was nicknamed Bull Connor because he was like so intense and violent towards the people as the police commissioner. And so the people in Birmingham invited Martin Luther King in to run this campaign. Now, I will say there were a lot of people who were very critical of this. They basically said, like, Martin Luther King, what are you doing here? You're not from here, right? Like, why are you coming in and instigating all of this stuff? And he is going to defend himself after he gets arrested, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, but basically what they did in this campaign, they did boycotts, they did marches, etc. Probably the most famous incident is the march, because at that march, the police force attacked protesters with dogs and fire hoses. You saw the dog picture earlier. Here's a picture of the fire hose situation. Also, some of these marchers were very young. You can see on the left, those pretty young kids that are involved. And so all of this is broadcast, some pictures and some live. And it's kind of a turning point. Like, people in the United States see this and they're like, whoa, like, this is not okay. And so the press shocks the country and people begin changing their minds about this. More people are going to get inspired to participate in the movement as a result. Martin Luther King Jr. and a whole bunch of other people were arrested in this march. And Martin Luther King writes a letter from Birmingham jail. And this is now a really famous document, and it is a defense of why he's doing all of this. Like, why did he come into this city? Why did he decide to pursue all these nonviolent campaigns? And if we end up talking about Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X, we'll dig into that more next week. Okay, so again, you got one more picture of the fire hoses on these people. And then on the left, that's a picture of Bull Connor. Okay, so as the public changes their mind about all of this, you're going to have more people decide that they want to participate. And this leads us to the March on Washington, which occurs in August of 1963. This is when Martin Luther King gives his super famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And he does that in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Okay, so if you look over at that picture on the bottom right, you can see all the people that have come for this march. So that's actually about 250,000 marchers that show up. On the back side, so you can see there's that pool, and then that I don't know exactly how to describe it. The building that's like super high back there, that's the Washington Monument. And then on the side where Martin Luther King is speaking, that's actually like the way the picture is taken. It's like you're taking it from where Martin Luther King is. That is where the Lincoln Memorial is. So there is this throwback to slavery, right? There's this symbolism kind of calling back to Lincoln, who freed the slaves with the 13th Amendment. This whole area is referred to as the National Mall. So if you ever go to DC, it's a really cool area. There's a whole bunch of monuments. There's also nearby like a Korean War monument and a Vietnam War monument. But this is where he gives his really famous speech. All these people show up and they're basically saying to the federal government, hey guys, do something, right? They're asking for the enforcement. Okay, so here's one more picture. You can see again, this is taken from where Martin Luther King would have been standing. Okay, so quickly, we're going to recap the events that we talked about in the early 60s and then going into JFK's term. So you can see the pictures are going to pop up on the bottom. You're going to try to remember what these events are. So that bottom left, what do you call that event? That's right, the sit-in movement. Okay, when activists from SNCC are putting economic pressure on businesses to integrate, national press draws attention to restaurant segregation. That's a new part of the conversation. Okay, then we have this picture of the bus. Anybody remember what that event is called? Sorry, the Freedom Rides or the Freedom Riders, what the people in it were called. Activists from CORE demonstrate Southern resistance to the court ruling integrating the buses. Okay, third event, you can see right there. What's that one called? It's right, the Birmingham Campaign. This is April to May of 1963, led by Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference. National press coverage of police attacking protesters shifts public opinion, which leads us to our last event, which was, that's right, the March on Washington in August of 1963. 250,000 people show up to pressure the federal government to make changes. Okay, so next time we are going to be looking at what is the federal government response in the form of laws. There are a few major laws that are passed as a result of all of this protesting, and that's what we're going to be looking at. So hope you guys are doing well. Stay safe out there. Love you guys. Bye.